Director of the UC Energy Institute. I'm also a professor at the Haas School of Business. Within the UC Energy Institute, there is an in-house research program called the Center for the Study of Energy Markets. And most of the research, all of the research I'm going to talk about today, has gone on under that center, which is supported largely by a grant from the California Energy Commission. I also teach a course at Berkeley, at Haas, that I want to mention since there are a lot of graduate students here, called Policies and Strategies in Energy Markets. If you're interested in sort of the market side of energy, it's a graduate course that has gotten a lot of crossover enrollment from mostly Energy and Resources Group and Public Policy, but also some engineering students. And it is open to everyone, and actually the mix makes it a much more interesting course. I'm also, by the way, the faculty advisor at Haas to the what is now the Berkeley Energy and Resources Collaborative, BERC. And if you are not familiar with it, I strongly urge you, if you're a graduate student interested in energy, to take a look at the BERC website, which I believe is berc.berkeley.edu, berc.berkeley.edu. Okay. Today what I'm going to talk about is issues in implementing dynamic retail electricity pricing. I'm going to actually narrow it down fairly quickly to talk about real-time pricing, and I'll get back and define that in a minute. What I'm going to try to do is cram in 30 minutes a discussion of 3 different papers I've written, and then try to cover some other topics beyond that, and talk about some more research that others at the Energy Institute have done and some ongoing research. For years, we have priced electricity at the retail level in a pretty static way, either one price at all times of the day and night, or a couple of prices, one price for peak and another price for off-peak. But in fact, the cost of procuring and producing electricity varies dramatically over the day and over the year. And when you take into account the scarcity at some times that makes electricity very valuable, the traditional ways we've priced electricity have really captured very little of that fluctuation. And in fact, if you do an analysis of the proportion of the wholesale price variation in electricity that is captured by even peak-off-peak, what's called time-of-use pricing, it's generally less than 10%. So even the attempt to have a peak-off-peak system, it is better than just a completely flat rate system, but it's still a very poor proxy for the actual fluctuation. As a result, during peak times, people don't have enough incentive to conserve electricity because they don't face a price that reflects the true cost. And during off-peak times, they actually don't have enough incentive to expand their use of electricity because during off-peak times, it's much cheaper. So instead of seeing a cheap off-peak price where, for instance, it might be very attractive to charge a plug-in hybrid, and an expensive peak price where it might be very attractive to pre-cool a house or to adjust the air conditioning, they see a price that's the same all the time. Without dynamic pricing, we also not only see those incentives in the short run that lead to misallocation of consumption, but we also see a very strong incentive in the longer run to build a lot of extra capacity because you don't have that price lever to address the problem when you get into a very high demand period. So instead you have to build a whole lot of capacity that sits idle most of the time just so you can be ready on the hottest day of the year. There are a lot of forms of what are called dynamic pricing. These are prices that actually are responsive to the environment instead of set days, months, or years in advance. We can pay people to reduce their consumption during emergency periods. We can have interruptible tariffs where you get paid in advance or get a lower rate, but if the utility needs the power, they shut you off. We can have high prices during the afternoon for critical peaks, for specific days, where if the utility determines it's a bad day, the price instead of being 20 cents at peak is 75 cents per kilowatt hour. Or we can have a system called real-time pricing where the prices actually change hour to hour. And that is, to economists, the gold standard of electricity pricing. It is the way to have prices that truly reflect the cost of consuming electricity. And by doing that, it gives customers the right incentives to conserve electricity when the market is very tight, to use more electricity when the market has plenty of capacity and the cost of production is low. There are a number of complaints, however, and concerns about real-time pricing that have been raised. And I've been actually deeply in this discussion since 2000 and was sort of studying this even before then. And have spent a lot of time since 2001 in the electricity crisis trying to address some of the concerns that customers and utilities have raised about moving to real-time pricing. And in fact, the papers I've written are basically motivated by discussions with policymakers and market participants about what they think would work or wouldn't work or what their concerns are about real-time pricing. In fact, although in California the policymakers tend to believe that if it isn't being done here, it isn't being done, that really misses the reality in real-time pricing quite a bit. There is actually a program in Georgia, the state of Georgia in the United States, that is 15 years old, actually 17 years old now, that has been running a real-time pricing program for large industrial customers that now includes about 1/3 of their entire load. Peak load is on real-time pricing. There is a lot of evidence from that this actually does yield peak demand reductions. That is, there is price responsiveness and changes the way you operate the system. Let me just make one side note. Dynamic pricing, real-time pricing, is not electricity deregulation. The two actually are completely unrelated, except for the fact that they both have at their heart the idea that incentives might be a good thing. Now, incentives can be a good thing, and I would argue in real-time pricing they're a very good thing. But incentives can also be a bad thing. When a company has an incentive to shut down their power plant in order to raise wholesale prices, that's probably not a good thing. But beyond that commonality of incentives, real-time pricing really has nothing to do with electricity deregulation. In fact, the most successful real-time pricing program in the country is in Georgia, as I mentioned, and that is a completely regulated system. Some of the real-time pricing programs that have been pretty successful are in systems that are also restructuring, but many of them are in systems that are really under traditional rate of return regulation for a utility. They do generally involve some connection between the price at the retail level and what's going on in the wholesale power market. But basically every utility these days is integrated into the wholesale power market. And so they do face some real market price at the wholesale level for electricity. And they can use that in some way to set a price that varies hour by hour. So either their direct cost or their opportunity cost hour by hour changes with the wholesale price of electricity. There's a lot of evidence of customer responsiveness when you actually do vary prices. And that's good because that's where all the gains are really coming from. Georgia Power, just to give you their stylized fact, is they have 5,000 megawatts of peak consumption on real-time pricing. They say on the hottest day of the summer, they get about 800. They get a minimum of 800 megawatts of demand response, of reduction in load. What I mean by minimum is when they do their security planning for their system, they actually count on getting 800 megawatts. They count that as part of their reserve margin. So they view that as really very, very certain that they'll be able to get it. New York instituted a program about 5 years ago that has shown a lot of price responsiveness and particularly shifting from peak to off-peak periods. California recently ran a program that wasn't a real-time program but a critical peak pricing program where the day before the utilities, this was a pilot program, maybe some of you were on it, I wasn't one of the people asked to be on it, where on days that are anticipated to be very high load days, you get a warning that it's going to cost 75 cents a kilowatt hour tomorrow and between 2 and 6 instead of 22 cents. And what we found is there is significant reduction in demand from consumers. There is a program that's now being instituted in Chicago that's a residential real-time pricing program. Some of the early evidence there is also that consumers, particularly residential, tend to be very responsive to the high prices. The goal here is not to have a customer say, oh, the price is really high, I'm going to shut off my air conditioning and die of heat stroke. That is not the goal. That is often characterized as the goal by people who are trying to resist the implementation of real-time pricing. In fact, the goal is exactly the opposite. The goal is to make sure that the reduction in use isn't done in a drastic way by a few consumers, as happens, for instance, with interruptibles, but instead occurs in a smooth way with all consumers or many consumers making a reduction. So instead of a few people turning off their air conditioner on that hottest day of the year, most people turn their air conditioner from 74 degrees to 78 degrees. And the movie theater that is so cold that you still need to wear a sweater on the hottest day of the year has an incentive to adjust their air conditioning. Okay? The idea is that many customers make small adjustments. There's a whole economic theory about this that points out that that is a more efficient and less costly way to adjust to changes in resource constraints than having some customers make huge adjustments and other customers act as if nothing's changed. Actually, let me, yeah. The first paper I wrote about real-time pricing, trying to do something analytically to get a handle on this, grew out of, in part, the California electricity crisis and the common claim, accurate, that if we had had real-time pricing, it would have lowered wholesale prices a lot during the crisis, and we wouldn't have ended up paying as much. And that's true. But the response from the industry to that was, wait a second, you got to be very careful in distinguishing between true efficiencies and economic transfers. Sure, if the price had gone down, consumers would have been better off, but producers would have been worse off by almost the same amount. And at some point, producers do have to earn enough to cover their total costs. So you can't just count that as a pure social gain. What you have to think about is how much would real-time pricing actually improve the efficiency of the system. And that sort of prompted my first paper of trying to use some data on actual load profiles, actual costs of production for different types of capacity, base load, mid-merit, and peaker capacity, and look at, well, how big would the gains be if we got some price response? That is, if at the peak, hottest summer day of the summer, some of what happened is the price went up and people reduced their consumption. And as a result, you didn't have to build as many peaker plants. Conversely, consumption would go up at the off-peak times, and as a result, you ran your baseload plants at higher efficiency capacity utilization levels. And so what this paper did is try to work through empirically how big could those savings be at various assumptions about demand response. And what I found was that even with very little price elasticity, the benefits from implementing real-time pricing would far exceed any estimates of the cost. The benefits were hundreds of millions of dollars per year for the California ISO system conservatively. The problem is, not the problem, but it is worth pointing out, that the energy costs in the California ISO system are in the billions of dollars. So even though these benefits are quite significant, they are very unlikely to be more than 10% of the total energy bill. So I just want to be honest about this. This is not a panacea that you're going to cut energy costs by 40% through real-time pricing. The fact is, it's going to have very little effect on total consumption. Peak consumption goes down, but off-peak consumption goes up. The gains come, and the paper sort of shows this, the gains come from smoothing out those peaks so you don't have to hold as much excess capacity for those super peak periods. To 10% of your energy costs these days would actually be less than 5% of your bill these days. But these days it's because our bills are loaded up with costs from the California electricity crisis and a number of other things. So the average residential bill is only about half or a little less than half energy. There is another benefit from electricity, from real-time pricing, that I'm still starting to work on and trying to figure out how to characterize, and that is the stuff happens benefit. That is the unanticipated events benefit. And last summer gave us a great example. We had this 2006 heat storm, which I kept getting called by reporters and some people who were quoting some people at the PUC saying, or the CEC saying, this is a once-in-50-year event. And I kept saying, well, it's a once-in-50-year event looking backwards. It may not at all be a once-in-50-year event looking forwards. But if you do planning that way, you're going to get surprised a lot. The advantage of real-time pricing is when you do get surprised, you have one more lever to pull to try to respond to that. Unfortunately, modeling being surprised is pretty hard beyond just taking a probability distribution. But of course, if the utility knows that probability distribution, they're not surprised. They see it as some event. But it does reduce the cost of blowing it in some sense in the planning because you have more flexibility. And that's an area I'm actually starting to work on now. But there's been a lot of resistance to real-time pricing in California. Customers are worried about bill volatility, that they would see huge variations in their bills. Less sophisticated arguments are that their bills would just be higher, that real-time pricing would just raise their cost. And my sort of the humorous insight of this was that during the electricity crisis, the large industrial customers were really opposed to real-time pricing because they said this was just a subterfuge for the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, to screw large industrial customers relative to other customers. So real-time pricing never got off the ground. But of course, the joke was the CPUC didn't need real-time pricing to screw large industrial customers. They just went ahead and screwed large industrial customers anyway and raised their rates. So they had a valid concern, but they were sort of looking in the wrong direction. Utilities are worried about making sure they get enough revenues to cover their costs. And this is sort of a new way of getting revenue, and they don't quite understand it and don't quite trust it. Some customers have a valid concern for them that they are currently getting cross-subsidized and they would lose their cross-subsidy. And because essentially they are the more expensive ones to serve. And then there are a number of other issues that I'm going to try to get through pretty quickly and cover if we have time. And then at the end, I want to talk a bit about some of the environmental interaction between real-time pricing and climate change and environmental concerns. So the next research I sort of started out on was trying to first sort of do some policy presentations explaining what hedging is. There's this amazing lack of understanding, even among energy people, of how hedging works and why hedging can lower the volatility of your bills, and how it particularly could work in this market. So if you think of real-time pricing as hour by hour, you pay for all of your electricity at that hour's wholesale electricity price. Turns out, yep, it's going to be pretty volatile. Now, the first thing you have to realize, though, is hour by hour isn't how you pay your bill. Month by month is how you pay your bill. And you probably really don't care how volatile your bill is hour by hour. You care about how volatile it is when you actually have to pay it month by month. So when you smooth over the month, does that make most of that go away? Yes, but it actually still leaves your bill, it turns out, in the best simulations I've done on this, 3 to 5 times more volatile than it would be under simple flat rate or time of use pricing. So there still is a lot of volatility that could result from real-time pricing. That is what's known as one-part real-time pricing, where you just pay for everything at the real-time price. But that's not how you would actually implement RTP, and it's actually not the way it's been successfully implemented in places where it has happened. It has always been implemented with some sort of a two-part program. And the way a two-part program works is you buy some power in advance for all the days of the year, but particularly for the summer afternoons, at an expected price. So essentially, this is a long-term contract for power delivery. You don't know which day is going to be the hottest day of the year. You don't know which day is going to have the huge price spikes. But you're willing to pay some average afternoon price for power delivered in the afternoon, and the sellers are willing to accept some average afternoon price. So essentially what you do is you buy some amount of power for every hour of the entire year, and then you buy the additional power you need at the spot price, hour by hour, or if you bought too much, you actually sell back the power you have a right to at that same spot price. And that is, by the way, how futures contracts work for any commodity. You buy it. If you want all of it, you take delivery. If you want more than that, you buy some more. If you actually want less than that, you sell back the extra you have. The critical point, there are two critical effects of that. One is it massively reduces the volatility of your overall energy costs. And the other is, in any hour, the true marginal cost of consuming a little more electricity is the spot price. If you need to buy it, then it's the true marginal cost because you actually got to go out and procure it. If you have extra, it's the marginal cost because it's your marginal opportunity cost. If you don't use it, you can sell it at that price. So it preserves your incentives in terms of very high prices on the hottest day of the year and lower prices at other times, but it greatly reduces your volatility. And what I did in this paper is actually went through and analyzed how much it could reduce your volatility and found that very simple hedging strategies, by the way, the CSEM working paper series is on the UC Energy Institute website, which is www.ucei.org. And in this paper, what I did is I actually looked at, I got data on consumption of large PG&E customers, and I looked at how volatile would their bills be. These are the largest customers who actually got the meters put in 2000, 2001 that track hour-by-hour consumption. Your meter on your house doesn't do that. And what I did is I looked at, well, how volatile would they be if they did no hedging? And that's the result that the volatility would be 3 to 5 times higher than if they were under a TOU, a time of use just peak off peak, or a flat rate. And then I said, well, what if you did simple hedging? Nothing sophisticated, nothing you need to hire a specialist to work on. You just looked at your past consumption and you said, on average in the summer, I use this much in the afternoon. In fact, you just break it up into peak and off-peak periods for summer and peak and off-peak periods for winter, and you buy blocks that's equal to your expected consumption, your average consumption. Turns out that, what I would refer to as dumb hedging, I mean, you do not need to know much to do that, eliminates on average about 90% of the increased volatility. Essentially, with a very simple hedging program, this volatility argument goes away. It turns out, though, you can do better than that for sort of a neat reason that I'm not going to spend, that if your consumption is positively correlated with the price in the market, you actually want to over-hedge to reduce your volatility further. And I'm not going to spend time on that because I don't have much, but I'll just tell you that if with over-hedging, you can actually do better than 100% hedging, because essentially at the time when the price is high, you have extra stuff and are selling it back. And that can actually reduce further. And with overhedging, you can get less volatility than if you were under just a flat rate bill. So this can actually be made an attraction and give you a more stable bill. The second issue that I tried to address is meeting revenue requirements. I think I'm going to move through this quickly, but essentially the concern of utilities is, well, you know, we had a pretty good idea of how much we needed to charge to cover our costs under the old system where we set a flat price. Now you're saying we should charge a different price hour by hour. But the same argument that I just made for consumers also applies to utilities. Utilities can hedge, can cover their risk by procuring on a long-term basis to match their sales on a long-term basis. So just like you aren't paying for your power hour by hour, the utilities would procure most of their power on a long-term basis. And then what they would be charging hour by hour to consumers would match the stuff they actually have to procure on the market hour by hour. And there's a lot more behind that, and this is a paper I'm in the process of writing that tries to say that points out the way you do this is the utility charges prices that essentially are hour by hour prices, but just like with fixed rates, move a bit year to year or month to month to make sure that the revenue requirement exactly balances. And the bottom line is that the utility will almost certainly have an easier time avoiding revenue cost mismatches than they have under the current system. The next issue that often comes up is customers who are worried that they're going to lose out with real-time pricing, that their bills are just going to be higher. There are two problems here. One is a rational problem. The other is an irrational problem that it seems that 90% of the customers think they will be in the half or so of customers who would be made worse off by this. It's not the case, but there seems to be just resistance that somehow their overall bills would be higher. I think what they think is, boy, look back at the California electricity crisis. If they had passed through those incredibly high prices, I would have had to pay more, which is true in that month, but instead what we did is we're paying for that on an installment plan. Our prices are high for years to come, and so we still ended up having to pay for it, and those costs were almost certainly higher than they would have been if we had actually had some price response during the crisis. So using the same data set, what I did is I asked the question, well, take these customers, look at what they did pay, and look at what they would have paid if they'd been on real-time pricing. Now, some customers really do pay more on real-time pricing, and the reason is they are customers who disproportionately consume at peak times. So the customers who on the hottest day of the year, their demand goes up, and it goes up by more than the average demand goes up. They're being subsidized right now under the current system. Under the current system, they are the ones who benefit from the fact that prices don't reflect those high costs at the peak times. So in this paper, I analyzed, well, how big are those transfers? How much worse off would some customers be and better off than others? And the answer is actually sort of reassuring. The transfers are much smaller than most people think they are. In fact, 95% of all customers, this is actually an overstatement, 95% of all customers fall between minus 6% and plus 8% in their bill. Now, that's not zero, and for a customer whose bill is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, it's a non-trivial amount. But if your bill is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, your company is probably doing revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and so it's probably not a big effect on your overall earnings. So this idea that there are going to be these huge transfers of wealth really doesn't seem to be borne out in the data. To the extent there are transfers, what can you do about it? And I think I'm going to move through this quickly, but besides just saying tough luck, which turns out not to be a very politically viable strategy, because the people who think they would be losers are pretty politically powerful, there are ways to essentially say, we're going to grandfather your consumption. We're going to take what you have been doing in the past, and we're going to continue to let you buy that at the regulated rate. And then any additional upwards you have to buy at real-time prices, and any savings you can sell back at real-time prices. And what that does is it essentially embeds a subsidy for the customers who have been subsidized in the past. Now, you can think that's fair or not fair, or politically expedient or not, but the fact is what it does is it reduces these transfers so that the customers who wouldn't normally be made better off, the ones who had a very flat load profile, don't get made as much better off, and the ones who would have been made worse off don't get made as much worse off. So it's a way of damping these transfers. So what do we need to actually implement real-time pricing? Well, the first thing we need is a credible real-time price. And this has been sort of a political hang-up. I think this is actually a red herring. A lot of people have said, well, we just don't have a day-ahead price that we could use that's a believable price since the California Power Exchange shut down. It turns out Georgia Power doesn't have a day-ahead price either. Georgia Power just makes it up. Georgia Power takes a forecast of tomorrow's price and says, that's the price we're going to charge you for each hour tomorrow. Now, the first day you do that, it may not be very believable. But if you start doing it, and customers can look at the history and can look at what the prices actually ended up being in the spot market, after a while it becomes a pretty credible mechanism. You're not fooling them for months on end. Maybe one day you could trick them, but they're going to figure it out pretty quickly. So I think this is really much less of an issue. I actually don't think you need a day-ahead price, and I think the right way to run a real-time pricing program is with the price in the market, which is an hour-by-hour price. And people say, well, that's crazy because that price is so volatile. It is volatile. It would actually be a lot less volatile if people are on real-time prices. But if you're hedged, if you've bought most of your power on long-term contract, that volatility has very little effect on you. And let me just give you an analogy. Jim Bushnell, my colleague at the Energy Institute, is on the Market Surveillance Committee of the California ISO. And Jim, the ISO recently raised their price cap to $400 from $250 a megawatt. And some state senator, and I don't remember who it was, so I won't say it. Wouldn't even if I did, I guess. No, I'm actually not that politic. I would if I could remember. Said, this is outrageous. 2 weeks later, the price went to $400. It did. But 40 megawatts of power traded at $400. This is in a system where the system load is 36,000 megawatts. So essentially, yeah, a little bit traded at that very high price, but almost everybody had purchased almost all their power beforehand. And so that high price, while giving strong incentives, actually didn't affect the total cost of electricity for people very much at all. Infrastructure needs. This is the part that probably relates closest to people here. We're installing the meters. PG&E is already well on the way. Southern California Edison's either dragging their feet or thinking it through a little more carefully, depending on who you talk to. And they are on their way to installing meters that can monitor hour-by-hour consumption. There's already some infrastructure for price responsiveness. When you talk to the engineers about this infrastructure, they tend to yawn. This is stuff that can, get this, read a price off the internet and automatically adjust your air conditioning. Now, if you think about that, it just doesn't sound very challenging, and I'm an economist, and I could probably program that. And so, it's just not very sophisticated technology. Now, you could do a lot better than that, and it may be worth doing a lot better than that, and as technology improves, you will do a lot better than that. But the idea that, as one PUC commissioner said during the crisis to me, look, people aren't going to run around turning their lights off when the price goes up. And that's right, their computers are going to run around turning the lights down. And that turns out to be a pretty technologically easy thing. We already have in our house a dishwasher that you can run in the middle of the night. It's a pretty small step from there to a dish, and we have a programmable thermostat that reads a clock and changes the settings. It's not that hard to get from there to something that reads a price and changes the setting. It does require reliable meters. And this is one of these things that, being an economist, just baffles me. When you go and talk to the people in the industry, they say, well, that's all great, except, the meters don't work that well. They often have read errors that we have to interpolate. Now, I don't understand why in this day and age that's still happening very frequently, but the people at the big utilities see this as a major issue, And you can see how it could interact and become a major issue. Think about the hour the price goes to, if I had my way, $1,500 a megawatt. Well, you really want to make sure the meter read is accurate. If there's 1 hour when the price really skyrockets, you don't want to have the meter not recording your consumption that hour and having to interpolate that hour. So this is potentially a real problem. The billing people bitch and moan, and what they say is so ridiculous that I'm not going to go into it. But the idea that you can't, I actually had a billing person say, this would mean 744 different prices each hour, each month. And I said, that's how many hours there are in a month. And I said, yeah, that's right. And my PC could run that entire billing system for 10 million customers. So that can't be the problem. Maybe there is some software issue, but it's not the fact that there's a different price every hour. I think I'm going to skip through voluntary because I only got a couple minutes. Let me talk about the environmental effects because there are a whole bunch of misconceptions here. First of all, people often confuse real-time pricing with energy efficiency. Do not do that. Real-time pricing involves high prices at peak times and low prices at off-peak times. And it is not necessarily a winner on environmental grounds, and it is almost certainly not a winner in places like Pennsylvania. If the base load is being served by coal-fired power plants, moving people to a flatter load profile increases CO2, NOx, everything. Load smoothing is not necessarily environmentally friendly. In California, it probably is. In most of the U.S., it turns out, and there's a paper written by some of my colleagues, it probably isn't. It does, however, make more economic other uses of electricity that involve storage, and particularly hybrids and plug-in electrics, either hybrids or just pure electrics, that can charge at off-peak times when power is cheap. And to the extent that you're displacing the emissions from internal combustion engine, that could actually be a net positive depending on the energy efficiency of whatever the storage is and the emissions of wherever the power is coming from. That is, zero-emission vehicles, of course, are only zero emission at the tailpipe. They're not zero emission upstream. I think one of the most exciting areas in real-time pricing's interaction with environment is the intermittency issue. A big problem with wind, and to some extent also with solar power, is intermittency, and the engineers' views who run the grid that you can't have very much of this stuff because it's just not reliable. If you have smooth demand adjustment as those sources peak or wax and wane, you actually can much more smoothly adapt to the intermittency of these renewable sources. So, for instance, if the price is varying as the wind blows and then it stops blowing for 10 minutes and then it starts blowing again, you can have air conditioners that are changing, and if the wind isn't blowing for a few minutes, can ratchet down, and in doing so can reduce the system load. That's actually very easy to do conceptually. Exactly how effective that interaction is, I don't know, but I think it's potentially very, very promising. I will say that there are other people at the Energy Institute, Stephen Holland and Aaron Manser, who have visited, have written the stuff I just referred to about load smoothing, as well as some short-run effects. Frank Wolak's done some work on analyzing critical peak pricing response. Rob Letzler, a graduate student finishing at GSPP, who's a graduate student at the Energy Institute, has a paper that tries to essentially use some of the behavioral economic insights to get people to essentially, it's this equivalent of a Christmas savings account for your electric bill. You put money in, and then at those times when prices are high, you automatically get it back, and so you don't see as much bill shock. I think that real experience and the economic analysis shows us that real-time pricing can yield big savings. They are not life-changing, probably, but they are hundreds of millions of dollars in a system like the ISO. There are real concerns. I think they are completely addressable, and I don't just think it. Other real-time pricing programs have done it. California should be moving in this direction. At the same time, I think we got to understand this is a way to save dollars. It will save dollars. It will save hundreds of millions of dollars in California. It is not directly a way to save the environment. It does have various complex environmental interactions which are worth thinking hard about. It does also, though, get us in the direction of pricing things in ways that reflect their true costs. And certainly if we're going to deal with CO2, one of the things we got to start doing is pricing energy in ways that reflect their true social costs. And I think conceptually this is a nice step in that direction. Thank you.
Is there a speculation opportunity by location, say San Francisco, where I buy hot time summer electricity and it never gets hot, and I sell it all when it gets hot in the interior?
Well, you can't really, I mean, you can speculate on that, but you got to, with all speculation, believe you're going to beat the market. When you buy that summertime power for San Francisco, they're going to sell it knowing that if they don't sell it to you, they might be able to sell it in the inland area in the middle of the summer. And so the price is going to reflect that. So I think it's unlikely that you're going to make much money beating the market there, just like you aren't probably going to do it beating the stock market. It's pretty much the same efficiency argument.
Another question from the floor? Yeah.
Hi, I just had a question a little bit more about your price smoothing and that sort of thing. It seems to me, and maybe this is a naive idea, and I'm curious to hear what your comments are, but when you do that pricing that way, it seems like it would reduce the peak hour consumption more than it might raise the off-peak hour consumption. So it seems to me that the net energy consumption, may be less. And if that's the case, why isn't that environmentally better?
Okay, so it could. It could be the case that people respond more to high prices and reduce their consumption and don't really respond to low prices. It depends very much on the elasticity of demand at peak versus off-peak. We don't really have good estimates of that. But the little bit of evidence that we do have is that the net effect is pretty small. That we do get peak reduction, but we do get sort of peak reduction, we get big peak reduction, but we get small off-peak reduction over many, many more hours. So the total production change is actually probably pretty small.
Santa Barbara County has probably 300 times the offshore wind potential that it needs for its electricity. And they're doing this analysis of producing a whole bunch of electrical power, probably 3 times what they need, and then offsetting petroleum with it for, like, cars, with electric cars.
Ah, there we go. That was the link I didn't get. Okay.
And this would all be impossible without real-time prices, because you're dealing with a market where the greatest majority of your power will be produced by variable sources.
Yeah.
And so I know you didn't say against this, but in this situation, real-time pricing is incredibly environmentally friendly because it enables a technology that never would be able to.
Yeah, so that sort of, it's not quite the point I made at the end about intermittency, but it's a very closely related point that what the engineers worry about with wind is, boy, if the stuff might disappear on short notice, we got to carry a lot of reserve capacity. And in fact, in the extreme, they say we need to carry exactly as much as there is wind in spare capacity because it all could go away in a second. Statistically, that's a sort of stretch as long as it's not all in the same location. But there is this concern about intermittency. To the extent real-time pricing is the only price you get for your energy, then selling at the real-time price does make sort of this intermittent power more attractive. The problem is, to the extent that they penalize you for being intermittent and not reliable, that it makes the renewable technology less attractive. The real value, I think, gets back to the point I made that with the real-time pricing on the response and the demand side, you may not need to penalize intermittency as much because the demand side makes it much less costly to back up that intermittency. And I think that's potentially a big effect. We got somebody with a microphone.
Oh, sorry. I'll be quick. I have a question about what you think real-time pricing would do to solar incentives. I mean, there's some
I've written a
overlap.
paper on this.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
Okay. I was going to
So
say there's some
there's-
overlap between peak solar and peak, energy demand. And would this be? You think it would be harmful, or do you think it
No,
would be beneficial?
it's a big boost to solar. It's not a big deal for central station solar, which in my opinion is the solar we should be talking about because it's much more cost-effective than solar PV. It is a boost to solar photovoltaics that are on the other side of the meter because essentially what you're getting credit for is the flat rate, and solar produces more at peak times. And in fact, what I found is if you are on a flat rate tariff and you put in solar, the value of the energy produced by the solar is actually, if you switch to real-time pricing, it would increase the value of that energy by about 40%. So it's a pretty big difference. Unfortunately, even when you do that, solar PV is just not even close to economically competitive with other renewable energy sources.
To what extent does the economics that you see for real-time pricing impact something like local energy storage, like cold water or ice storage, in a residence in order to smooth the residential peaks?
I mean, it obviously makes it more attractive.
I mean, is it even close?
I don't think that I don't know that technology well enough, but it's very unlikely to be better than the technology on an industrial scale, and the industrial scale stuff isn't economic. So I doubt that the residential implementation would be. That's an area, that is the great frustration of people who work on the economic side, because if we could do more efficient storage, it would just completely revolutionize the industry. And it's the lack of high efficiency storage that causes the problems. And by the way, if we could do real high efficiency storage, I wouldn't be talking about real-time pricing because the prices wouldn't change in real time very much at all. Natural gas prices don't change very much because gas is more storable. And oil prices, nobody would talk about hourly oil pricing.
How does that impact the hydrogen issue? I mean, hydrogen's a way of storing electrical power.
And it's a just really crappy way of storing it is the problem. Hydrogen is, a great idea whose time has not come. It's 20 years off, and it continues to be 20 years off. Yeah. I mean, it's not close to economic. It is, scientifically feasible. The problem is the cost side just doesn't work out. Yeah.
For the last 7 years, Californians have leveled their energy consumption per capita without real-time pricing. Why was that successful, and what would RTP improve it?
Okay, so what you're asking is about total energy consumption. And as I said, real-time pricing has no particular implication for total energy consumption. At the same time, during the last 7 years, Californians have massively increased their peak energy consumption. And we found that out the hard way last summer. And the problem is, by the way, until that heat storm comes, the ISO is just guessing at how many people have put in more air conditioning and how many people have more stuff that's going to kick on. And then that heat storm comes and the surprise happens. And this time it turned out to be a 2,000 megawatt surprise. That is, there was 2,000 megawatts more demand on the system than they thought there could possibly be. And it was all, hiding in people's basements and windows, and suddenly it all sprang to life during this heat storm. And that's what real-time pricing would be great for. Cool.
Yeah, you seem to advocate to be very favorable to hedging as a way to mitigate the volatility, but at the same time, you seem to be down on interruptible program. Now, I don't see what's the difference. It's just a matter of price versus quantity.
No. Interruptible programs are not interrupting 1% of your consumption. They are shutting you down.
No. You can have interruptible where you have a certain amount that is your baseline, and you interrupt up to a level that you choose.
You can get into this game of figuring out what your baseline is and paying people to reduce from that and all that. And essentially what you're doing is backflips to avoid just pricing the product.
They had demand subscription at Southern California Edison 20 years ago, which is exactly you subscribe to so many kilowatts that you want to have firm, and then you're willing to interrupt incremental megawatts on a radio notice.
And now you've done enough backflips that you've almost recreated a real-time pricing system with hedging. That is, you've bought a bunch of stuff firm, and you're paying for the rest at some incredibly high price. And that's all, by the way, most interruptible programs are. They don't really physically interrupt you. What they do is they charge you an incredibly high price if you keep consuming. And just to let you know, there were a whole bunch of customers during the crisis on interruptible rates who didn't realize it because it had been used for the previous 10 years as just a way of giving discounts to industrial customers. One of them was the pipeline that carries fuel to Los Angeles International Airport. And they got told to shut down. And they said, it told you either shut down or you pay $9 per kilowatt. They decided to pay the $9 because they shouldn't have been on interruptible. But, yes, interruptible programs, if you design them enough, start looking a whole lot like real-time pricing programs, and I like those. Dumb interruptible programs where you just shut them down, I don't like as much.
But the difference is who holds the switch. Because if the system operator holds the switch the way the interruptible programs do, then they can rely on it more in the reserves and everything, as opposed to giving the switch to the customer to
You are an engineer. I am an economist. I believe that if you got a whole bunch of customers facing prices, they respond. By the way, the interruptible customers also are facing prices. They don't have most of them still hold the switch. They can override.
Oh, okay. Well, it's 1 o'clock, which is the time, I think, for us to thank the lively discussion and our wonderful speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you.